From Diamond Light Source, this is the Diamond Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Diamond Light Source Podcast, with me, Meera Senthilingam. In this edition, we probe into the world of engineering to see how scientists at Diamond are exploring and improving materials used in industry. We'll be finding out about a new beamline opening at Diamond that's revolutionising the way samples can be analysed using a synchrotron.
It's different from other beamlines at Diamond in that the X-rays can penetrate through much thicker and denser materials. It's also designed so that we can do both imaging and diffraction experiments on the same sample.
We also learn why an understanding of cracks and defects in a material is crucial for safety in industry.
Cracks and defects happen for all sorts of reasons. It's important to catch those cracks before they become fatal and we get catastrophic failure. So that's materials in the aerospace industry, in the nuclear industry, where you really can't countenance failure.
Phil Withers will be explaining how his team are looking into these defects later in the show, when we also investigate how the structure of metals can be modified to make them more resilient, and how an understanding of corrosion could be crucial for the storage of nuclear waste. All that, plus the latest news and events from Diamond, coming up on the November edition of the Diamond Light Source Podcast.
The Diamond Podcast. For more information, look us up online at diamond.ac.uk/podcast.
Now, a new beamline went into operation at Diamond this month, the I-12 beamline, which is changing the field of engineering research, as it will allow analysis of samples up to 2 tonnes in weight, with X-rays that can penetrate thicker materials than ever before. Here's beamline scientist Thomas Connolly to tell us more.
Well, here at Diamond, we're just about to start operations of the new I-12 beamline, which is designed for researchers in engineering science, the engineering community, and also in processing, to do experiments they've not been able to do at a UK facility before.
What is this new beamline?
The new beamline is called JEEP, which stands for the Joint Engineering, Environmental and Processing Beamline, and it's designed to deliver a very intense beam of X-rays to study different kinds of samples. It's different from other beamlines at Diamond in that it uses much higher energy X-rays. That means that the X-rays can penetrate through much thicker and denser materials. It's also designed so that we can do both imaging and diffraction experiments on the same sample. So imaging is taking, say, an X-ray picture or something, and diffraction is looking at how the X-rays are scattered as they go through the material.
Now, the beamline itself isn't quite ready for use yet. It's under construction but due to be opening soon. So we're here in our fluorescent jackets, hard hats and steel-cap boots. But you took me on a tour earlier around all the separate areas of this beamline and it seemed very long. Just how long is this particular beamline at JEEP?
The beamline in total is about 100 metres long. That's the distance from the X-ray source to the final sample position. But we have 2 sample positions. The first is at 50 metres from the X-ray source, and the second, as I mentioned, is 100 metres from the source. The reason we're so far away is that we want to be able to have a big building where we can put large samples that our users want to bring. And so the 100 metres point is in the external building where we are now, where we've got this quite large experimental area that's nearly 11 metres long, 7 metres wide and 5 metres high for engineering experiments.
Yep, so we've actually got the final hatch outside here now, and basically from here it looks like a large warehouse, and I can't believe that samples that large can actually be probed and looked at with these X-rays.
Well, this is the unique thing about the JEEP beamline. In engineering, you want not only to do small laboratory-scale experiments, but you also want to look at what's happening in real components or what's happening in real industrial processing. And sometimes you can't take small samples from a component. You need to bring the whole component here to be able to study it. An example of that might be, say, the engine casing from a jet engine off a passenger airliner. An engineer may be interested in measuring the internal stresses in a small part of that engine casing, but you can't cut out that small part and take it to a beamline because that would change the conditions of the component itself. You need to bring the whole component so you can study and probe it as it would be in service.
So how does the beamline actually work to create these high-intensity X-rays in order to then probe these large samples?
The beamline starts with an X-ray source, which is in the synchrotron storage ring of diamond. So there we have a special device called a wiggler, which oscillates an electron beam and generates a very intense beam of X-rays. We then take that X-ray beam and we do a couple of things to it. The first thing we do is we filter it. We do that by passing the X-rays through different thicknesses of material and types of material to condition the beam to the energies or wavelengths we want to use. The second thing we can do is monochromate the beam, and that means that we choose a particular wavelength for the experiment. We can switch between the two modes. We can just use a filtered beam, or we can put the monochromator in and just pick a particular wavelength for the experiment.
So what kind of samples are you expecting to come in here, and what kind of research are you expecting to take place at JEEP?
There's all kinds of research we're expecting. I mean, probably the more traditional engineering materials you look at, so steel samples, maybe aircraft components. We've already got users who are interested in looking at aluminium alloys and how they solidify. So they're going to come with a little furnace and watch how the aluminium behaves as it freezes. And also we're expecting users who might want to look at chemical processing. They might be interested in deformation of materials at high temperature. So they might want to come with a test rig which will not only heat the sample but also stretch it or apply a load to it. And that's important for understanding how materials behave in service. It's difficult to say what's going to come in, but some things that I might expect to see would be quite large steel components, say a steam pipe from a power station or maybe, say, a wheel from a railway carriage, because engineers are also interested in studying the entire sample and maybe looking at the internal stresses that can be a problem. It's very important to measure those stresses because they can affect the way that cracks grow. And if you've got a power station, you want to be sure that it's going to be good under service conditions for the 30 or 40 years that the power station is operating.
That was Diamond's in-house beamline scientist, Thomas Connolly, explaining the function and importance of the new Joint Engineering Environmental and Processing Beamline, or JEEP, at Diamond. Now, we've had an insight into the role of the new JEEP beamline. So now we meet the scientists who'll be using it. And the first user to try it out will be Professor Alexander Korzunsky from the University of Oxford. He looks into the granular structure of materials such as metals to try and understand their strengths and weaknesses in order to improve their role in industries such as the aeronautical industry. I spoke to Alexander to find out what he sees at the granular level and how this can be studied to improve a material.
The main interest for me and the team of scientists that I work with is the origin of material strength and weakness. This question has very significant implications for the design of engineering structures, from mobile telephones to biomedical devices to aircraft engines to bridges and power stations.
And what materials do you look into?
We study the full complement of materials that are used for structural applications. Materials like structural alloys based on nickel or aluminium or titanium that are used in the construction of jet engines. But we also have an interest in polymer materials, such as those that are used in tissue scaffolding for biomedical applications, or in the ceramics that are used for dental applications.
How do you actually go about looking into these materials? Because you basically visualize the granular structure of a material. So how can you see that, and what exactly is that structure?
Okay. In order to try and imagine what the materials are like, it might be helpful to think of a cube of sugar. Now, a cube of sugar is really a result of gluing together individual grains, which we can see with our naked eye. Now, most of the metals that we use and metallic alloys are similar in their structure, except those grains are much smaller and need microscopy in order for us to be able to see them usually. And also they're held together in a much stronger way, which is why metals perform slightly better than a lump of sugar. But in order to see those grains inside, we usually use a development of what we're all familiar with as X-ray radiography. Now, in medical X-ray, we use a stream of X-rays directed at a body in order to obtain a shadow picture. Now, that shadow picture shows high absorption or high density where we have a lot of material in the path, and lower absorption where there isn't a lot of material. The only difficulty with that is that you only gain information about one projection, one view, so to say. And we all know that in order to understand the three-dimensional nature of an object, we need to look at it from different directions. So by performing this kind of radiography experiments from different angles, that allows us to see the way the grains fit together. And then the next question that arises is how can we measure the strains and stresses inside those grains? Now, that requires a further development of this approach, which is known as tomography. And so what we're working on now is strain tomography. In other words, we're trying to reconstruct the full three-dimensional distribution of stresses inside the material. And obviously, because the grains behave in a slightly different way, the strains and stresses between grains are different, and we can recognize that from our analysis.
What are these stresses that you look into? And then also, what have you found so far happens to the granular structure of the materials when these stresses fall upon them?
If we consider a lump of metal being subjected to external loading, and this loading could be mechanical or thermal, which often happens in practice as well, then we find that the external forces are transmitted through the body by way of the load being shared between different grains present there. We also know from our analysis that some grains would be very stiff. In other words, they will resist elastic deformation better than others, and those will carry the load, a large fraction of the load applied. There are other grains which are more compliant, and so they will deform more readily. But anyway, if we apply large enough force, the grains start to deform plastically, that is, deform permanently. And again, there are differences between neighboring grains. So we end up with a situation when the material which externally may look as a homogeneous, sort of uniform lump of metal, in fact is full of little peaks of stress. And we believe that those local peaks of stress are the ones that are ultimately responsible for failure and the initiation of cracks.
What can you do then to these peaks of deformation within the material in order to try and prevent the material from failing in the end and make it and improve it?
Since the stress concentrations, as we call them, depend on both the shape, the orientation and the structure of a particular grain, but also on the shape and orientation of the grains around it, then by controlling this grain structure, we can control the maximum stress concentration that occurs in a piece. In other words, by careful control and optimization of the treatment procedure that we apply to a lump of metal, we can force it to have the internal arrangement of grains which is the least susceptible to the problems associated with stress concentration and the possibility of crack initiation.
Having then hopefully understood this and being able to control it in this way, what materials could it improve and what benefits would this improvement provide?
So, for example, we would like to be able to prescribe the processing conditions that would allow dental bridges to be stronger so that they don't need to be replaced even in 20 or 30 years rather than after 5. By controlling the processing operations, we can help design better polymer composites that are used in the building of aircraft bodies or fast ships. The understanding and the tools that we develop are sufficiently generic to apply them to a vast variety of situations.
Alexander Korzanski from the University of Oxford.
Did you know that the Diamond Experimental Hall is so large a jumbo jet could drive around the inside?
You're listening to the Diamond Light Source podcast with me, Meera Senthilingam. And coming up, we'll be finding out how an understanding of crack formation can improve the ability of a material at high temperatures, and how an insight into pitting corrosion will benefit the disposal of nuclear waste. But before that, let's join Sarah Bucknell from Diamond's communications team for a roundup of the news and events that took place at Diamond over the past couple of months.
We recently announced that we've reached a significant milestone and solved our 100th protein structure at Diamond. It was solved by Professor Nick Keep's group from Birkbeck University of London as part of research carried out by Dr. Xingjiang Zhu from Ross Ansett Research, and that's the largest agricultural research centre in the UK.
And what was the protein structure that they found?
They solved the protein structure from the silkworm moth, which is a model organism within the field of insect molecular biology, in terms of understanding how insects locate mates and their hosts. This particular protein is related to how insects smell, and plants use chemical signals to repel and attract insects. So if we can learn more about these signals, then, for example, farmers can plant companion species to either attract or repel insects, depending on what they require. So this research can feed into areas such as pest control into agriculture and also the development and refinement of biosensors.
Now, that was your 100th milestone, but that was maybe a month or so ago. So what protein figure are you at now?
Well, we're currently experiencing an exponential growth in structure solved at Diamond. So we're already at around 140 just 1 month on. And we hope to reach around about 200 during next year.
I am assuming this is across a wide range of scientific disciplines.
That's right. For example, we recently had a first paper published on one of our Phase 2 beamlines, which is also a crystallography beamline. That's I-19. It's small molecule single crystal diffraction. So they're actually looking at smaller parts of the protein, and they recently solved a structure on that beamline, and the results were published in the journal Angewandte Chemie. And also we've had another paper published on one of our Phase 2 beamlines. It was the first one for I-11, which is the high-resolution powder diffraction beamline. In October, they've had some research published in Nature Materials, and this was on porous organic cages, which are important in areas such as catalysis.
You've also had a recent discovery to do with the flu virus.
That's right. We had an interesting paper published in the Journal of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, PNAS. Scientists from the Medical Research Council have been using Diamond to look at a protein called hemagglutinin, which is part of the flu virus that binds it to human cells when a person is infected. In the last century, there were 3 flu pandemics, one in 1918, 1957 and 1968. And these scientists are looking at the flu virus strain that caused the 1957 pandemic and are comparing it to the other 2 outbreaks. What they're trying to discover is why some avian flu viruses are more able to jump the species gap than others. So this may help identify which avian flu viruses are more likely to bind to human cells, and therefore could help in preparations for future pandemics.
Stepping aside from the science that's been taking place at Diamond now, what other extracurricular activities, if you will, have been going on there?
Well, we're continuing our outreach programme, and we recently had a successful A-level Inside Diamond Day pilot in early October, as well as another one for the public. The next public Inside Diamond is on January the 8th next year, and as usual, people can register via our website. But also in January next year, we're going to be exhibiting our growing artwork collection.
And what features of the collection will you be exhibiting?
Well, thanks to past projects such as Designs for Life and our Artists in Residence, we have a number of art pieces now. So we have 30 textile panels, which were worked on by the Oxfordshire Federation of the WI. And our Artists in Residence each produced a fantastic piece of artwork, which was inspired by Diamond. So we have a sculpture and we have a number of paintings as well. And they're all going to be on public display from the 11th to the 29th of January at the North Wall Gallery in Summertown in North Oxford.
Thanks, Sarah. Sarah Bucknell from Diamond's communications team. We'll be back in the next edition of the podcast with more news from Diamond. Now, this month, we're looking into the field of engineering to see how engineers at Diamond are looking to improve materials such as metals and ceramics that we use in industries, varying from fields as diverse as aeronautics to dentistry. So now we meet Professor Phil Withers from the University of Manchester, who's looking into the failure of materials used in engineering by analysing the formation of cracks and defects in these materials to basically stop them from failing.
We tend to look at materials where failure has to be avoided at all costs. So that's materials in the aerospace industry, in the nuclear industry, where you really can't countenance failure.
Now, when you say failure, what does it mean for a material to fail exactly?
There are all sorts of reasons why materials fail. Often it's because the applied stresses and the internal stresses exceed a certain threshold and cause immediate catastrophic failure. Sometimes it's because there's a defect in the material so that it fails at a stress lower than you would have otherwise expect it to fail.
So how do you actually go about looking into these materials to find faults and find cracks?
To create a picture, we shine very intense X-rays at our object and we collect pictures just like an X-ray picture you might collect at a hospital. These pictures show the defect, and by collecting lots of pictures, we can build up a three-dimensional picture of what's going on inside the material. We do two kinds of imaging. One is simply to create a picture like a shadow pattern where we can see straight through the material and identify cracks and pores to create an image. The other thing we do is we scatter X-rays off the object and use the atoms as a strain gauge to measure the stresses deep inside the material.
Now, you mentioned that you visualise kind of breakages and cracks within a material, but how do these actually get there in the first place? So what causes these cracks to happen?
Cracks and defects happen for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes because the way in which the material has been made has introduced a defect. Sometimes because a small notch or a small crack has started at the surface, and this has grown deep inside the material. It's important to catch those cracks before they become fatal and we get catastrophic failure.
And so, as well as looking at the actual presence of these cracks, you also look at the effect of external stresses on these cracks. So what kind of stresses do you look into, and what effect do these stresses have on the various defects?
We look at both applied stresses, the kinds of stresses that you put on when a material is under load in service, and we also look at stresses called residual stresses that lie locked in within the material. A good example of a residual stress is the stress that sits within thermally toughened glass. I'm sure you're aware when you see broken glass by the side of a bus shelter, those small pieces of glass have occurred because of the stresses that were locked in the glass before the crack started to propagate.
And so if you understand how these stresses affect the cracks and then finally result to the end breakage, what have you understood about the formation of these cracks, or what have you understood from your research so far in order to get in there and prevent this from happening?
Well, it's very important to be able to predict how long a crack will take to grow until it becomes a fatal crack. So we are developing the understanding that will enable us to measure cracks and to plot their growth before they become fatal, and also to find ways of stopping cracks. There are lots of ways in which you can interrupt the growth of a crack and stop it. We've been working with companies such as Rolls-Royce to find ways of putting stresses into materials such that the crack will actually stop before it becomes a fatal crack.
What kind of things can you put into it to stop it from happening then?
What you do is you make sure that the cracks are held shut. Cracks only grow when you try and pull the material apart. And so if you can put the cracks into compression, that's to hold them shut, then the cracks, even if they do exist, will simply not grow.
Having now understood this then, what are the treatments that you've come up with that are available then for the industries using these materials to prevent these cracks from happening or growing?
Well, one of the processes we're working on with a small company is to use lasers to shock the surface of the material. You shine a very bright laser at the surface and it creates a plasma on the surface, and that plasma creates a shock wave that travels deep into the material and puts the surface into compression.
And therefore, if it's under compression, any cracks in there won't grow.
You've got the idea spot on.
When you mention materials then, to what industrial materials is this possible to be done on?
Most commonly, we apply the techniques to metals. to protect fan blades or to ensure that materials that are operating in power plants operate safely, such as stainless steels. But we can also apply the method to ceramics and for use in biomaterial applications.
You've managed to do this so far with X-rays from synchrotron light, but now the new JEEP beamline will be opening at Diamond soon, which allows essentially larger samples to be monitored and penetrated. So how will it change your research?
It will enable us to look at materials operating in all sorts of conditions. For example, we'll be able to look at components operating at temperature, and we'll be able to look at the growth of cracks in corrosive environments. There's a whole range of exciting experiments that we'll be able to watch operating under realistic conditions for the very first time.
Phil Withers from the University of Manchester, with his insight into the failure and improvement of industrial materials. Now, as well as cracks and granular strains, another problem affecting the integrity of engineering materials is corrosion, which can wear away at even the toughest metals, causing irreversible damage. Dr. Alison Davenport looks into the causes and defects of corrosion, or more specifically, pitting corrosion in her case, and she looks into this at the University of Birmingham. So I spoke to her about how this corrosion can be stopped, and with regard to pitting corrosion, just what it is.
Most metals are covered with a thin skin of oxide called a passive film, which protects them from the environment. And usually that's pretty effective, but when there is damage to this film, or perhaps if there's some imperfections or impurities in the metal, you can get a little local site where corrosion can start to develop. And once corrosion happens, you produce corrosion products, which are themselves quite aggressive. It's a concentrated metal chloride, which is very acidic, and this is confined in a little pit in the metal surface. And this can grow, because it's so aggressive, it can grow and penetrate down into the interior of the metal.
Now, what is this, the actual coating made up of then? And when you say corrosion can happen, what is the corrosion that can happen on this material?
The coating is a thin skin of metal oxide, and it's remarkably thin. It's usually just a couple of nanometers. That's tens of atomic layers, and yet it's very effective in isolating the metal from the environment in which we live. And we're worried about wet environments here. And when the corrosion takes place, the metal will actually dissolve in the wet environment and react with the water to generate some acidity. And that's the corrosive element, which will then allow the pit to continue growing.
So what's the initial action that can happen to cause the beginnings of a pit?
That can be quite controversial in the field. There's quite a bit of discussion about flaws in oxide films, but it's usually well known that in engineering materials, these are impurity particles in the metal.
And so how are you then going about looking into when a pit forms and then this corrosion that happens within the pit?
Well, we've got two types of experiment that we're interested in doing. The first is looking at the shape of the corrosion site in 3 dimensions. And it's quite difficult to study this in 3 dimensions as a pit grows, because most of the really good techniques for studying the shapes of corrosion pits or studying shapes of small objects are actually vacuum-based. But because we're interested in corrosion in a wet environment, those won't work. So what we do instead is we use microtomography. So we take a little pin of metal, we put some salt on the tip so that it'll corrode, and then we measure radiographs as we rotate the pin, and these can then be reconstructed to give the 3-dimensional shape of the pit. So if we want to know how pits grow in 3 dimensions, so the way in which they can start penetrating down into the interior of the metal, we can look at this in real time.
But as well as visualizing this pit growing in action, are you actually looking into the actual chemistry within this pit?
Right, well, that's the other aspect of the work. It is known pretty well that these solutions are highly concentrated in metal ions and quite acidic, but the details of the chemistry aren't known very well at all. But again, X-rays are great for those because what we can do is take a little foil of metal and start corroding it from the edge and pass an X-ray beam through the cavity next to the dissolving interface and measure things like the oxidation state of the metal there, the coordination environment of the ions, and also if there's any corrosion products, we can identify those with X-ray diffraction. We found this quite useful, actually, because most of the models that predict how corrosion sites grow assume that there's lots of water in there. But we've actually found some quite dehydrated phases next to the dissolving metal surface, which rather changes the way in which you might think about modelling the growth of the pits.
So on what scale do these pits actually occur?
Well, some pits do actually grow to quite a big size. There are reports of millimetre and even bigger than that sized pits. But normally the ones that we're dealing with are tens or hundreds of microns. And what's more difficult is, in the case of stainless steel, they penetrate underneath the surface. So they're actually very difficult to see with the naked eye, apart from the fact that you can see a little patch of rust where the corrosion products have come out to the surface.
And what effect do these pits actually have on the material as a whole?
Well, it very much depends on the application. So, for example, if you were concerned about having a pipe, if the pit grows the whole way through the pipe, it'll start to leak. But there can also be other problems whereby if the pit has a rather narrow shape, if it's in a metal under stress, it can act as a site where a crack can start to propagate, and this can lead to quite catastrophic sudden failures of metals. There are quite a few different areas where people are developing pit growth models in order to predict how long a piece of metal will last in a particular applications. And we're trying to provide the ability to validate those models.
And so what kind of applications will this have? So what kind of structures and materials, say, in industry are you looking into?
A particular example of what we're working on at the moment are canisters for nuclear waste storage. The long-term aim is, obviously, with nuclear waste storage, is to put the canisters underground. But it's going to take quite a long while before this can actually be done. So in the intervening time, they're going to be stored above ground. And it's very important that the environment in which they're stored is one in which they won't undergo pitting corrosion and therefore perforate and potentially allow release of the radioactive contents. And so the people who want to store them want to be able to predict the rate at which pitting might take place under controlled conditions of humidity or deposition of dust which might contain salts, and be sure that it will be safe to keep them above ground for these long periods of time. And so we're providing the underpinning knowledge of how the corrosion actually takes place and the rate at which certain processes take place that can be used to validate the models over short periods of time and therefore give us confidence that the longer-term predictions will actually be safe.
Alison Davenport from the University of Birmingham, explaining the uses and modelling of pitting corrosion and how an understanding of this can help predict the lifetime of materials that are crucial in industries such as the nuclear industry. Now that's it for this edition of the Diamond Podcast, but do join us again in January when we'll be looking back at the past year to bring you the research highlights from Diamond in 2009. In the meantime, if you have any questions about Diamond or the research taking place there, the email address is podcast@diamond.ac.uk. You can also listen to previous editions of this programme online at diamond.ac.uk/podcast or nakedscientist.com/diamond. Plus, you can now subscribe to the Diamond Podcast on iTunes. I'm Meera Senthilingam. Thank you for listening and see you next year.
The Diamond Podcast is brought to you by Diamond Light Source and produced by thenakedscientists.com. There's more information on our website at diamond.ac.uk/podcast.